Hello and welcome to this episode of Walking London. Today we're going to be walking from Chelsea to Fulham. We're starting our tour here at Sloane Square. Sloane Square was originally Hans Town and laid out in 1771. It was named after Sir Hans Sloane, a hugely successful physician originally from Scotland who used to own these lands. He was once the physician to the new governor of Jamaica, and while he was out there he noticed that the locals were drinking a very curious drink made from cocoa or cacao. He found it quite a nauseous concoction, but when milk was added to it, it was much more palatable. He brought this drink back to England and sold it as a medicine, and eventually it was bought by the Cadbury brothers. When Sloane returned to England, he lived in Bloomsbury, but he bought a manor house here at Chelsea in order to house his collection of antiques. When he died, this collection was bought by the nation and they built the British Museum to display it. We're going to meet Sir Hans Sloane periodically again throughout this walk, so at least now you know who he is. But let's go to our next stop. Traditionally, England has been pretty good at caring for its invalid veterans since medieval times, but that charity began to dry up during the Reformation. Caring for veterans was still very much a problem though, and so the solution came in the form of the Royal Hospital at Chelsea. The hospital was designed by my favourite architect, Sir Christopher Wren, on the site of the old Chelsea College. The first stone was laid by King Charles II in 1681, and 10 years later the first tenants moved in. One of the more interesting characters to live here was Dr. Messenger Monsey. Before his death in 1788, rather than a traditional funeral ceremony, he asked for his body to be dissected and then thrown in the Thames. In the graveyard here lie two women soldiers, although no monuments to them have been found. The first one, Christina Davis, joined the army in order to search for her husband. She died in 1739. The second, Hannah Snell, also joined to search for her husband. She joined the army and also the navy, and when she died in 1792, the records state that she sadly died insane. Rather than just a hospital, there are actually people who live here, known as the Chelsea Pensioners. They've all served as ordinary soldiers in the armed forces. And if you nip into the shop or the museum, there is usually one of them working there, and you can engage them in a little conversation about what life is like living here. Walking past the National Army Museum and just nipping down Tite Street, you come to number 34, which was once the home of Oscar Wilde between 1884 and 1895. He is, of course, the famous playwright and writer, and he wrote most of his famous works in this house. Wilde had to sell this house in order to cover the legal costs he incurred when he was accused of sodomy by the father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. The Chelsea Physic Gardens are the second oldest botanical gardens in England after Oxford and were established in 1673. Sir Hans Sloane was an apprentice here as he was learning to become a physician and eventually came into possession of it in 1712 when he bought the 4 acres. He then leased the land to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries for £5 in perpetuity, as long as they used it for research into medical plants. This is a sum that the gardens actually quite sweetly still pay to Sloane's descendants today. There is a statue of Sir Hans Sloane in the middle of the Botanic Gardens. It's not the 1733 original, however, because that was damaged by pollution, and is currently in the British Museum. Albert Bridge was completed in 1873 and was never particularly a strong bridge. It's been reinforced several times over the years. There is even a sign on the old toll booth which instructs soldiers from the neighbouring Chelsea barracks to break their step as they march across. That's because synchronised marching causes vibrations that can very easily actually bring down a bridge, and has done several times around the world. It's no wonder then that this bridge has been given the nickname the Trembling Lady. It's also pink, blue and green in colour, and this is to make it more visible to ships so that they don't collide with it as they go through. Always a good thing. This amazing statue couldn't be in a less photogenic place. This is the Boy and a Dolphin made by self-taught David Wynne in 1975. He also in 1973 made Girl with a Dolphin, which is over at Tower Bridge. This sculpture, which seems to defy gravity, is made possible by a double cantilever in the boy's arm and the tail of the dolphin. Of this statue, Wynne said, "The boy is being shown that if you trust the world, the thrills and great happiness are yours. If one meets a dolphin in the sea, he is the genial host, you, the honoured guest." Wynne models the boy on his own son, Roland David Amadeus Wynne, who was 11 years old at the time. If you'd like to see what a well-preserved Chelsea house looks like, head up Shane Row and find Thomas Carlyle's house. It's now a National Trust museum. He is famous for writing the history of the French Revolution, and what is most impressive is that it was published despite the fact that the sole original manuscript was accidentally burned by a maid, and he had to write everything again from scratch because he'd already gotten rid of his writing notes. Chelsea Old Church is at the epicentre of where Chelsea really began as an isolated fishing village. It was as such until about the Tudor times, when it became more popular with wealthy Londoners who would come here for their country retreat. The church dates back to 1157, but as you can see, it looks a little bit more modern than that, and that's because it was very heavily damaged during the Blitz and had to be extensively rebuilt. It's very closely associated with one of London's few saints, Sir Thomas More, who has a statue somberly looking out over the Thames. Sir Hans Sloane is also buried here. He was buried here in 1753, sort of bringing that part of the Sloane saga to an end. This magnificent building is Crosby Hall, and it wasn't always here in Chelsea. It was actually built over in Bishopsgate in the style of a medieval hall and attached to Crosby Mansions. It was named after John Crosby, who was a city alderman and MP, who was knighted in 1471. It was later inhabited by the Duke of Gloucester, who would become King Richard III. When the mansion was demolished as part of a road widening scheme, Crosby Hall was actually lifted from its premises and moved here to Chelsea in the 20th century. It's now a private residence, so sadly we can't go inside. These are Cremorne Gardens, and they were named after Thomas Dawson, Lord Cremorne. He had a house that was originally on this site. When visiting these gardens, you could have very lofty ambitions indeed. There were balloon rides that would often ascend from this site up into the sky. One particularly ambitious man, a Mr. de Gruff, came here in order to try aerial navigation by putting an apparatus underneath the car of a balloon. He was then in that apparatus. It ascended to a great height and then was then released. Unfortunately, there was some kind of defect though, and instead of doing what it was supposed to do, it crashed to the ground and the one sole occupant was killed. At this point you have a decision to make. I've given you two different routes because they are two different lengths. If you're getting a bit tired and you'd like to have a shorter route, head up north on Ashburnham Road and east along New Kings Road. There's lots of independent shops and restaurants, and it's very quintessentially London. It's very, very nice indeed. Or you can take the route that we're going to be taking, Route 2, which takes you along the Thames Path to Wandsworth Bridge, and then we will meet up at Parsons Green. Imperial Wharf is one of our first stops moving out of Chelsea and into Fulham. As you can see, it's a very nice marina full of very expensive yachts bobbing up and down. It's also home to the Belvedere Tower, and at the top of it you might notice the Golden Tide Ball. This rises and lowers during the day to echo what's happening with the tide just outside. Should you feel like having a little bit of a more expensive drink or dinner here, you might find yourself rubbing shoulders with some footballers or some pop stars. The walk along the Thames Path route is a really lovely one if you like to walk along the riverside. You will pass Imperial Park, spread out over 10 acres, with 3 themed gardens celebrating aroma, sight and touch through nature. This area used to be just green, wide open spaces with the odd grand house in between, before London's population began to push more and more people into the suburbs. If you'd like to see what that used to look like and find a little about who used to live here, there's a really cool interactive panorama you can explore online. I'll leave a link to it in the description. Now that we're in Parsons Green, hopefully people from Route 1 and Route 2 have met and joined together, if you split up that is. This is Fulham proper, and it used to be a place full of market gardens. It was not uncommon to see omnibuses, butchers' carts, wagons and carriages going along the unpaved roads. In fact, it was regularly a massive complaint here. Fulham was also the site of 3 gallows trees, which is where highwaymen, when caught and convicted, were strung up in chains. This is the well-preserved remains of an old kiln which used to be where Fulham pottery used to stand. It was a business set up by John Dwight in 1671, and he became a household name in making amazing porcelain and stoneware. You can actually see early examples of this pottery at the British Museum. Behind me is All Saints Church. The first records of there being a church on this site are from the 13th century, though early remains of an even earlier church have been found to the south of the current building. Some rather random facts about this place are in 1611, pigs were not allowed into the churchyard. In 1738, people were stopped from drying or airing their clothes here. In the 1700s, it was described as one of the worst specimens of suburban churches. From the early 19th century, the churchyard was subject to body snatching. A very interesting topic if you care to look it up. It might seem a little strange, but this gravestone is my favourite thing about All Saints Church. It's to Isabella Murr, who was the wife of a local schoolmaster in the early 1800s. While this script is full of praise for her and she was clearly much well loved, the same could probably not be said for her husband, where in fact all it says is he's gone too. And so now we're here at our last stop on the tour, and this is the picturesque Fulham Palace, which was granted to Bishop Erkenwald in 631 AD, though since 1973 it's been run by the council as a museum. I would highly encourage you at the end of this walk to take a tour of the museum itself, or in fact come here as a standalone item of a thing to do in London. It's really, really lovely, and the library is particularly nice. Obviously, being as old as it is, this palace has a lot of rich history, so to give it to you in one video would take a very long time, and at the end of this walk, I'm kind of tired myself. But I would invite you to find this out for yourself by coming to visit or looking it up online. My favourite story involves a Bishop Porteous who used to live here, but the actual story occurred in Essex. In Elizabethan times, a game called Brag was very popular. Opponents had to try and outlie each other for a prize. In fact, it was so immensely popular that lion clubs were set up. Bishop Porteous was travelling through Essex when he came across a very large crowd, and when he inquired what was happening, he found out that a game of Brag was underway. The prize was a whetstone. Bishop Porteous was astonished and affronted by such a sin taking place in the town and ran forward to admonish them all. Very loudly in front of the crowd he proclaimed, "I have never told a lie in my life." At which time the chief umpire had a conference with the people who were there, and they proceeded to award him the prize of a whetstone. So that is officially the end of our walking tour from Chelsea to Fulham, and I hope you found out some really interesting things along the way. I could use your help again though, just like the last video. I'd like you to vote on what I do next. Would you like to see a tour of Hampstead or a patisserie tour of the centre of London? Let me know by clicking on the poll in the top right hand corner, or let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more videos from me, make sure that you click that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also click the bell notification button if you'd like to know when I next upload. And I guess I will see you very soon. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye!